Well, hello everybody, and if I look a little older than most of the videos, it's because I am. All the other lecture videos that you've watched were done basically during COVID, and this one, which is reading, I want to talk about the reading number 87, which is an excerpt from John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. This is a new reading in the anthology. I took out the old one, just a quick word of explanation. I'm actually slowly reading through Calvin's Institute, something I'd never done in my lifetime, which is kind of sad, but in any case, I'm reading it now, and it's quite a journey. And the former reading I used was a very famous one. It's the very opening of the Christian Institutes, or Institutes of the Christian Religion. And interesting enough, he alludes to that opening in the current excerpt. So you see that the one I have now, I think, is actually more representative of Calvin, more distinctively John Calvin, and fits a little better with kind of the angle I take with the other lectures, in a sense. So you see that this is from chapter 15 of his Institutes, with quite a title, Discussion of Human Nature as Created, of the faculties of the soul, of the image of God, of free will, and of the original integrity of human nature. Now, really, the only part that we're looking at, I think, well, I actually have a little bit from chapter 16 as well. So in this brief excerpt, let's just walk over a few of the important themes here. You see that number one, and this italicized material is italicized in Calvin's writing, man or humanity proceeded spotless from God's hand. So pristine, spotless creation of human beings in the beginning. Therefore, the human may not shift the blame for his sins to the Creator. Now notice what he says next. And by the way, that's a fairly standard idea in Christian tradition, that sin is not God's fault, really. Everybody would have to say that even if it's not God's fault per se that human beings fell into sin, we would have to go on to say that God did create human beings with the capacity for doing so. In any case, he goes on to say, we must now speak of the creation of man because, as we said at the beginning, and you notice I put it in brackets there at the beginning of this book, we cannot have a clear and complete knowledge of God unless it is accompanied by a corresponding knowledge of ourselves. And that's kind of it's uniquely and famously Calvin at the beginning of his Institutes. We could say also that we cannot have a clear and complete knowledge of ourselves unless that knowledge is accompanied by a corresponding knowledge of God. So knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves, Calvin begins at the very beginning of this text, that those are intertwined and necessarily implicated in one another. Now, if we were just to make a real quick summary of that opening, it would be something like this. It's only when human beings know themselves, number one, to be created, that we are creatures. And number two, that we're not just creatures, but that we are creatures who are fallen into the power of sin, the enslaving power of sin. So knowing those things about ourselves, then correspondingly, we know God to be creator and God to be holy, where we are creatures who have become unholy through sin. And so he goes on then, and we see that I've skipped down to paragraph 8. This is still in reading 87, of course. Free choice and Adam's responsibility. Man in his first condition excelled in that his reason, understanding, prudence, and judgment not only sufficed for the direction of his earthly life, But by these gifts of reason, understanding, prudence, and judgment, human beings mounted up even to God and eternal bliss. So he's given these capacities of human beings, which are gifts of God, a very high evaluation in the beginning. In the beginning, our reason and our judgment and all were perfect. Again, this is a pretty standard approach in much Christian theology. There have been a few exceptions to this, but usually it's affirmed in order to, we'll just say, take God off the hook. Like sin is our problem, it's our doing, not God's. So in the beginning, and often we've heard this, and probably you've thought it and even said it, well, human beings were created perfect. We like to use the language of perfect. Genesis never says that. We get the language of good and very good, but perfect is not really a term or an idea that appears in the early chapters, the creation stories in Genesis. Further, the more that you emphasize how pure and clean the human will and human reason and human judgment and human prudence were, the more difficult it becomes to speculate as to how in the world such a perfect human being or perfect pair of human beings could fail so quickly and so thoroughly. So you kind of paint yourself into a corner with an overemphasis on the idea of human perfection in the beginning. So, we'll just go down a little bit more here. He does say, therefore, a few lines down, Adam could have stood, that is, could have stood in righteousness and obedience to the will of God if he wished, because he was granted these gifts in the beginning, seeing that he left the presence and the will of God solely by his own will. It's the human being's fault. But it was because, and here's Calvin is so interesting here, it was because his will was capable of being bent to one side or the other. So the human will had this kind of pliability, flexibility, go one way or the other, and was not given, the human will was not given the constancy to persevere. Basically saying that God in the beginning gave human beings this power of will, but the will is a little flimsy, and what God didn't give us is this power to remain faithful, like at all costs and through all temptations, so that in fact, he fell so easily. He fell so easily until in destroying himself, he corrupted his own blessings. So this is a fairly standard doctrine of the fall. Calvin, though, it goes to greater lengths, I think, to defend God here. Calvin says, now, if anyone objects that the human will was placed in an insecure position because its power was weak and so, flimsy, it was not reasonable for God to be constrained, that is, like kind of forced, by necessity of making a man who either could not or would not sin at all. God was under no necessity to make human beings, where they were absolutely sinless and could not fall, right? Such a nature would indeed have been more excellent. He says it would have been more excellent if God had created us that way. But to quarrel with God on this precise point, as if he ought to have conferred this upon man, just to quarrel with God about this is more than iniquitous. It's more than sinful, inasmuch as it was in God's own choice to give whatever God pleased. Indeed, no necessity was imposed upon God of giving to human beings other than a mediocre, which is below average will, and even a transitory will, meaning like, again, bending this way one moment and the other way the next moment, very flimsy, very, weak. But God was under no necessity to give us a stronger will, and notice why for Calvin. That from man's fall, from the fall of humanity into sin, God might gather occasion for his own glory. Now, I think he's going to tell us that that own glory eventually is that God, because of all humanity has fallen into sin, God demonstrates divine power, omniscience, omnipotence, really, all power, by choosing which human beings God would bend their will toward God, predestination. So we move then, I'm going to talk very quickly about the second excerpt from chapter 16, which is basically, as you read carefully, and I'll trust you to read it more carefully, Calvin just says, whatever occurs in the world occurs by the direct will of God. So I think I've mentioned this in maybe in other lectures, but this is more than just predestination. Predestination is about God choosing the elect who will be saved. And if it's double predestination, God is also choosing the non-elect who will be damned. But here, Calvin is moving beyond predestination to predeterminism. That is, that God determines all things. You notice that how this concludes. If we accept these things that he argues for, it is certain that not one drop of rain falls. Not even a single drop of rain falls without God's sure command. And notice sure command means definite and specific command, as opposed to maybe more the idea of, let there be rain and, fall where you will. This is God directing all details. There's probably the most dramatic instance of this is right in the middle of the paragraph. Calvin writes, indeed, some mothers have full and abundant breasts, full of milk, but others are almost dry, as God wills to feed one baby more liberally, but another baby meagerly. Wow. Basically, Calvin's willing to let the problem of evil in this regard fall on God's shoulders. God is the one who determines all of these details. So let us remember there is no erratic power, action, or motion in creatures, but that they are governed by God's secret plan in a way that nothing happens except what is knowingly and willingly decreed by him. Not just known by him. This isn't just God foreknowing, it is God decreeing. Decreeing what? Decreeing everything. For Calvin, this is a picture of God's glory. As a Wesleyan, I find a lot to object to here, but I wanted to just kind of walk through this with you. I hope you'll read it more carefully. It's really a good taste of Calvin's doctrine, really of what we call divine providence, God's presence and controlling will in the world. Thanks.